Hey guys, just want to conclude this series with how to respond to crisis, how to respond to trials, tribulation. There's so much going on right now in this season that I do feel like that there's a vast number, or a large number of people that are enduring sufferings, enduring some sort of trial or tribulation. However, I do want to just make sure everybody understands that I don't feel like this is the great tribulation. I don't even think it comes close. I also feel like that there will be some of this generation that will extend into that season of that great tribulation, of that time of testing, that time of that season of trial, and just before that season. So this isn't just for this current season, but I also believe we need to make sure we understand the principles, the biblical principles of how to respond to trials, how to respond to hard times and sufferings, even persecution. The American church has a hard time wrapping our minds around real, true persecution, physical persecution. But I do believe that we all have to be prepared to endure whatever we may come encounter with. If we come in contact with persecution, physical persecution, if we come in contact with verbal or emotional persecution, those are all things we have to be prepared to handle, how to be prepared to respond to biblically. So again, that's what this series was about. I hope it's been a blessing. I want to just recap real quick what we talked about last time, because I think that finalizes kind of the heart or the essence of what the biblical response is more or less us taking our view towards God instead of toward the circumstance. If we get hung up on the circumstantial things that are going around, and we're looking at everything that's happening, and we take our eyes off of God, we lose that flame, we lose that passion, and that love that we have for God. And what we want to do is to strengthen our inner man, to strengthen our spirit, is to stay focused in on God, prayerfully pressing in. I feel like that's why God is called this season as a season of drawing near, drawing close, because I do believe that as we place our eyes on God, as we fix our eyes on God, our attention on God, we grow spiritually, grow stronger. I believe that is the essence of the tree of life. I'll try to do a teaching on that, sometime in the near future. But what that tree of life was the essence of that way of life of interacting and depending on the nature of God, depending on the heart of God. So when we looked at this in the last part of this, in part 5, we saw that how Moses become this intercessor, or this person in between the people and God. God had actually called the people in Deuteronomy verse 36. He says, out of heaven, this is Moses reflecting on what God's design and what God's desire was, his initial heart. And we know what happened. We know that the Levitical priesthood was set up. We know that the law was set up, and we went through these years of the Judaism, where we, the Gentiles, didn't have any concept of that. But during that time, the Jewish people had this religious system of legalism and religious routines through the Levitical priesthood, where only a select few could enter into the real presence of God. In our New Testament life, we are all kings and priests. We are all priests who can enter in. We are in this new priesthood, this new covenant priesthood, that we can enter into the presence of God, enter into the fellowship with God, and for ourselves, and not depend on a mediator. Well, that's similar to what God's heart was. He was showing that heart in the New Testament, in the Old Testament with Exodus, when he brought the children of Israel out of Egypt. And he was expressing himself, saying he wants to speak to them, and they desired to draw back out of fear. They were afraid. And it says in verse 36 of chapter 4, this is Deuteronomy, this is the reflections back to kind of what went on during that time of Exodus. He says, out of heaven he let you hear his voice, that he might instruct you. On earth he showed you his great fire, and you heard his words out of the midst of the fire. Man, he was saying that on earth you heard his voice. On earth he was expressing himself to you. He was desiring to draw you into something deeper, and you resisted it. And in chapter 5, he comes back to that. And again, this is all about reflection. And he goes back and he talks about himself. Moses is saying, I stood, in verse 5 of chapter 5, he says, I stood between the Lord and you at that time to declare to you the word of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire. You were afraid because of the fire. That was the reason Moses was standing in that in-between place. And there's a lot about what Moses does that gives us a picture of what Jesus would do later on, of being that intercessor. But I believe, and this is just my take on it, I'm not right about everything, so you just take it with a grain of salt, but I believe that this is really talking about that wasn't God's design. It wasn't his heart, because he says it was because of you. You were afraid. And because they were afraid of the fire, they resisted and they drew back. But God was calling them to himself. I really believe when you look at Exodus 20 and you see that whole story where Moses enters into the fire, but the people drew back because they were afraid, that was not God's desire. God didn't desire his people to draw back. He wanted them to draw near and draw close. And, if we're not careful, excuse me, if we're not careful, we will experience certain trials, experience certain hard times, and we will resist it. We'll draw back, we'll pull back, and those are devastating for our spiritual life. It doesn't mean that we fall out of grace or anything like that, but it's that we fall out of that tender relationship that really helps us endure through trials. Man, I've seen people who endured heavy trials, heavy times in life, either through sickness or through family issues or even through persecution. And man, their glow about them, there was a spiritual glow, a spiritual joy that they expressed, even in the midst of all that. And it is unbelievable and it's unexplainable. But where does that come from? It comes from a desire or a relationship that has their eyes focused in a different place. If I look at just my circumstances, if I look at just what's going on and I just pay attention to the fire that's going on, I become more and more overwhelmed, more and more discouraged, more and more fearful, and I get sucked into this really depression, anxiety, mindset. I think that's why one of the biggest issues right now in our society, our culture, is depression and anxiety. And I've battled with both of those. Don't think that this is like, oh, if you battle with that, then you're unspiritual. I struggle with those same things. I battle with depression. I battle with insecurities. I battle with anxiety. So all these things do affect everybody. But how we overcome those things, how we resist those things, and how we walk successfully over those things is through Him. It's not through anything that we do. There's nothing I can do to break off depression. There's nothing I can do to break off anxiety. There's nothing I can do to resist or to overcome, per se, all these things that come against us from the enemy. We can resist those things. We're commanded to resist those things, but we are also given grace to overcome those things. Some of the things that Paul struggled with, he had these trials and he even asked the Lord and was praying and seeking these things, but God just told him, I've given you grace and my grace is sufficient. His strength, God's strength, is made perfect in our weaknesses. When we experience those weaknesses of our own self and we're not able to do things in our own self, He expresses His own strength, and we actually build this deeper appreciation or deeper love or deeper worship towards God and praise towards God and thankfulness towards God by these seasons of suffering, that we look back and we say, God, I just don't know if I can handle this. He says, it's okay. My grace is sufficient. My grace is enough. So one of the things that I want to just make sure we understand is that as we conclude the end of this age and as we conclude in the end times, those seasons, those times of trials will get more and more intense. And if you notice that with the way Jesus describes, he says, the end times will come on the world like a woman in labor, like labor pains. And I think that's an illustration of when you see a woman in labor, or and I know many of you either have kids or you've had kids, the females, the moms and dads that have had kids know that when the mother goes into labor and she starts to experience those birth pangs, the contractions start at a certain period of interval of time, and then they grow more and more closer together, and closer together till finally it's just this constant ongoing contraction right before the birth. And I believe that's kind of the way the end times will look. It'll be an expression of that labor pain where it grows more and more the successions become closer and closer together. So we have to be prepared. We have to look and see where these things are happening in our world. Pay attention, be alert, be watchful, looking at what's going on, and paying attention to what the Bible says about these times and being prepared. How we prepare for the end times, and if you haven't seen the video where how we prepare for end times, that's another good topic about. It's not just about an end time study, it's just about how we respond. It's very similar to what we've been talking about the last several teachings here. And it's just, how do we respond is being watchful, being prayerful, being constantly putting our eyes back on Him. So, I think about how, the church has endured sufferings in the past and how these things have went on. And I think about how, even the church at Smyrna, in the book of Revelation, how they experienced this intense persecution, and the Lord didn't come to them and say, well, I'm going to get you out of that. I'm going to take you out of that. Because that's what we think of a lot of times as being delivered, is God taking us out of a bad situation. But sometimes He's going to leave us in that situation in order to perfect His purpose. And we have to understand that that's an eternal view. It's an eternal vision. We don't always understand that. We have to look back at Job and think about how Job responded to sufferings, and how God responded to Job. When God responded to Job through those sufferings, He said, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? And what was God saying in that? He was saying that my wisdom, my decisions of making all these decisions, and how I judge certain things, and how I produce certain things, and how I operate certain things, this is all based on a very deep understanding of how things work and what my eternal purposes are. And it's way above our ways. The things, I don't even understand most of the things that are physical, and I understand very little about spiritual. So, in the concept, the grand scheme of looking at both of those cooperating together, and God is all encompassing of all knowledge, has all wisdom, and for me to try to understand even a fraction of that is kind of prideful. So when we understand we don't understand, when we understand we don't understand, then we can kind of move forward and say, God, I don't really understand what you're doing, but I trust you. I trust that you do. And like Job said, though he slay me, I will trust him. And that's what we see in Smyrna. The church of Smyrna, he tells them they're going to suffer for 10 days. And you think, okay, I got 10 days. 10 days, I can get through 10 days. Well, then he says, well, after that 10 days, he said, if you'll be faithful unto death. So after 10 days, and be faithful unto death. In other words, he wasn't giving them a way out. He was just telling them that 10 days of suffering, and then they're going to kill you. But then he said, but I will give you a crown of life. So Smyrna had to have an eternal vision. It had to have eternal perspective. And for the church in this hour, in this season, in this time, we have to build an eternal vision. We have to build a vision for what is going on beyond these 70 years. We have to look beyond it to the eternal purposes of what God's called us to. Because we're not promised tomorrow. We're not promised a happy and just fun-filled life, full of entertainment, full of just success, full of money, and all these things that the world tries to give us the concept of. We can't have a world view. We have to have a godly view. And that's what God's called us to. So be faithful in those things. Be faithful in what God's called you to. And just know that the genuineness of your faith is much more precious than gold. Though it's tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. That's from 1 Peter 1, 6 through 8. Just check out those verses. Man, listen, be blessed. This has been a good series. Love you guys. Just continue to press in. Be faithful.